Hi, my dear students. Today we are going to talk a little bit about economic fluctuations, and this is going to be a kind of introduction to business cycles. We will present them, or I will present them, in next movie clips. They will be presented in two parts. Using classical theories and the Keynesian theory to explain business cycles. But today, economic fluctuations. And before we actually speak of economic fluctuations, let's kind of refresh what we know about economic growth. As you remember, we introduced the idea of economic growth when we were talking about gross domestic product. And talking about gross domestic product, we distinguished between nominal and real GDP. Nominal calculated using current prices, and real calculated using constant prices, and those constant prices were simply thought to rule out inflation, right? And then we said, well, this distinction between real and nominal GDP is going to be useful because we can measure economic growth using real GDP, so we are not fooled by inflation, right? We do not get the false idea of growing GDP because of growing prices. So we measure economic growth in real GDP, and that could be real GDP as such, or it could be real GDP per capita when we want to look at how much we produce per one person. Why economic growth is important? It does not obviously eliminate scarcity, the main economic problem, but it makes it less painful. By less painful, I mean having economic growth, we can consume more, and also at the same time we can increase our possibilities to produce more in the future. So this is a kind of recapitulation, but remember this economic growth was listed as one of our major macroeconomic goals, right? 4 major macroeconomic goals were stable prices, low inflation, in other words, low unemployment, by low we mean close to natural unemployment, high and stable, what is very important from the point of view of our meeting today, stable economic growth, and balance of payments that is in equilibrium. So we've got 4 major macroeconomic goals, and when it comes to economic fluctuations, 3 of them, stability of prices, the level of unemployment, stability of economic growth, those 3 are directly connected to economic fluctuations. And we could also see that balance of payments would also be influenced by economic fluctuations. Economic growth is important in the way that it accumulates over time. It is somewhat similar to compound interest. When you collect money in your bank account and this bank account, this deposit gives you compound interest, then to the principal amount of money you get additional money from your interest, so this principal gets increased, so your interest is calculated from ever growing principal amount. This is similar here with economic growth. Look at the graph here. It shows you three paths of growth. This is a long run approach. We use the period like 50 years. Why 50? Well, you are kind of 20 now, right? 20 and something. So after 50 years, you'll be 70 and something. So just like now, you are about to enter the labor market, you are about to become self-dependent, you are about to create your own household, then in 50 years time you will probably retire, you will withdraw from the labor market. So this is the could say the time of your active life as an adult, right? From 20 and something to 70 and something. So imagine that we speak of a certain initial level of gross domestic product in some country. Let it be $1,000 billion, right? This initial level of GDP. And let's assume a 3% economic growth over those 50 years. Remember, this is real GDP that we talk about here. So, after those 50 years, this gross domestic product will be more than 4 times bigger, meaning that over those 50 years, the average income of people in the society would quadruple. Not double, not triple, quadruple, meaning will be 4 times bigger. And remember, this is real. So this is after ruling out inflation, right? It is that you really can afford 4 times more things, goods, services than you could 50 years back. And it is enough to change this path a little bit, like changing it from 3% of annual growth to 4% to make the final result 7 times bigger than initial levels, right? So it almost doubles the result from 4,000 billion to 7,000 billion. With this small little change, we change the growth from 3% annually to 4%. If you could double this growth from 3% to 6%, then actually you would make the final result more than 4 times bigger. Compare 4,000 billion to more than 18,000 billion, right? So as you can see, those small differences in annual economic growth would translate into huge differences in final output. That's very important. That allows you, for instance, to understand why China sees such a major increase in the level of their well-being over those years, because for a few decades they had a period of constant economic growth, and that wasn't growth like 3% or 6%, it was like 10% or 12%. So that is really, really huge, right? Economic fluctuations. The idea that economy develops not in a stable way, but sometimes it develops faster and sometimes it develops more slowly. Could that be a result of changes in potential gross domestic product? Well, if you think of what are the determinants of potential GDP, then you would say, well, first of all, what we can produce is based on resources that we have at our disposal, being it population, capital, technology, know-how, and this is what actually allows us to say what would potential GDP be, or how big it could be. Certainly, this potential GDP changes. It tends to grow because of technological progress. So we develop our economy having better and better technologies. So even if population doesn't grow, then usually capital grows, and usually we have better technologies, better ways of using this capital. So GDP generally tends to grow quite smoothly, but obviously there could be some special situations when potential GDP suddenly decreases. This could be droughts, these could be floods that would impact agriculture, impact food production, and therefore impact the whole economy. These could be wars, right? When a country goes for a war, then usually that destroys a lot of potential in this country. What else? This could be, for instance, some natural disasters like earthquakes, right? They can cripple the economy. Well, even now, when you think of this COVID-19 thing, okay, there will be, or there are already, some influences of this disease on global economy, meaning both on aggregate demand and also aggregate supply. So we can say this potential GDP can be changed, can be influenced by this disease. You can think of them, okay? You can think of the consequences. What kind of economic fluctuations could this virus actually make happen? Economic fluctuations are simply deviations from potential GDP. So as you can see, this black line here, climbing steadily, this is potential GDP, growing over time. As we mentioned, because of improvements, technological progress, better capital utilization, and so on and so forth. And you can see the blue line of actual GDP, and this actual GDP sometimes tends to be higher than potential GDP, sometimes it tends to be lower. So there is a certain gap, there might be a certain gap between potential and actual GDP, and we call them respectively expansionary gap and recessionary gap. Expansionary gap when the economy expands above the potential GDP, and recessionary gap when we have recession, when our actual GDP falls below potential one. How is it possible that actual and potential GDP are different? Well, both classics and Keynes would actually agree it could be different. They both could be different one from another. The real difference between classics and Keynes would be, for classics, this difference between actual and potential GDP would be a proof that economy is not in equilibrium. So they believed in equilibrium being possible only for potential GDP. And they would say, well, we can have this kind of disequilibrium for some time, but obviously quite quickly, because markets would adjust quickly, because prices are flexible. That's what classics would claim. we will get back to potential GDP. For Keynes, that would be different. He would argue there could be a major difference between actual and potential GDP, and that's not about the lack of equilibrium. There could be equilibrium, especially, well, actually, there could be equilibrium when we have recessionary gap, when actual GDP is below potential GDP. Keynes would not also believe that expansionary gap can happen when we have equilibrium, right? We don't have it then, right? So you have here this GDP gap defined as a difference between actual and potential GDP. You can also have a look at percentage GDP gap. This is kind of more useful approach for two reasons. One, because we usually are more acquainted with percentage GDP changes. So you are quite more likely to know what was the GDP growth in your country over last year or the previous year. And this is always expressed in terms of percentage change, like we had this GDP growth of 4.2%, for instance. But actually, most of you would be pretty helpless if I asked you, all right, so what is actually the value of gross domestic product? This is the kind of data we use less often. So percentage GDP gap is in this sense more reasonable. It is also more reasonable because of the so-called Okun's law. We are going to talk about it in a minute. So let's have a look at expansionary gap first. You can see both models here, the Keynesian model to the left and the classical model to the right. In the Keynesian model, you've got equilibrium denoted with letter E. You can see this point here. And imagine what happens if aggregate demand grows bigger, right? So this aggregate demand line shifts upwards. There would be a new equilibrium level. Theoretically, there could be a new equilibrium level just near this arrow. But as you can see, this equilibrium, this new equilibrium, when you look down, it would have to cause the economy to grow far beyond the potential GDP, the potential income, the one with asterisks. So we know we cannot expand the economy above this level, not in a sustainable way. Or we can do it for a second, for a short time, but we cannot sustain that over time. So this vertical difference between this vertical distance between AD and AD prim would mean our expansionary gap. You can see this also in classical model. This graph to the right. AD shifts to the right. There is a disequilibrium here, and this disequilibrium would disappear, prices would go up, and the new equilibrium is achieved, right? So we've got kind of inflation resulting from expansionary gap, but we do not have increase in GDP. It's not possible to grow beyond potential GDP. For recessionary gap, we wouldn't see usually inflation. When we have recessionary gap and actual GDP is lower than potential, we are not afraid of inflation that much. We are more concerned about unemployment, because if we do not need such high production as potential GDP would suggest, if we produce less, then demand for labor would also be lower. So if this demand for labor is lower, then cyclical unemployment appears. And this is this Okun law that I mentioned before. This Okun law finds and describes a certain relation between cyclical unemployment and GDP gap, because this percentage GDP gap equals minus beta times cyclical unemployment. So you can see that actually the bigger is cyclical unemployment, the greater is percentage GDP gap. Or the other way around, you can say, well, the bigger is recessionary gap of GDP, the greater cyclical unemployment would appear. So, for instance, if we have no cyclical unemployment, if cyclical unemployment is zero, the percentage GDP gap is zero, and that would mean that actual and potential GDP are the same. So if our actual GDP is equal to potential, we do not have cyclical unemployment. The unemployment we're going to have is only this voluntary one based on frictional unemployment and structural one. If we assume that this voluntary natural unemployment is, let's say, 5% and our actual unemployment rate is 8%, that would mean the difference between 5 natural and 8%, which is actual unemployment that we can see. That means we've got cyclical unemployment of 3%. So if our cyclical unemployment is 3%, then our GDP gap is from 6 to 9%, depending how big this beta is, right? So it is usually from the range between 2 and 3. So 3% cyclical unemployment would translate into the information that our percentage GDP gap is from 6 to 9. Let it be, let's say, 7.5 to have it in the middle. That means that our actual GDP is 7.5% lower than potential GDP. So we kind of lack some production. We do not use our potential fully because we don't have full employment here. So this is Okun's law. For each 1% increase in unemployment rate above natural unemployment, which is obviously different in different countries, the percentage GDP gap increases by beta being from 2 to 3%. So we've got our natural rate of unemployment, quoted here again for Okun's law. So let's assume that this natural unemployment is 5%, and currently our actual unemployment is 3.5. Then it's like we had a negative cyclical unemployment of 1.5, or you could say more correctly, we are below natural unemployment, right? Natural is 5, actual 3.5. So we are below natural unemployment. We are below that by 1.5%. So we've got expansionary gap here. How big is it? Well, multiply this 1.5%. This is how much we are below the natural unemployment rate. Multiply this 1.5% times 2 or 3%, our beta. So our expansionary gap here is between 3% and 4.5%, right? We've got expansionary gap, and therefore inflation would occur, right? The economy would react by general level of price increase. That's why, with some simplification, we could say this natural rate of unemployment could be also called NAIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. If our rate of unemployment is natural, then this unemployment will not accelerate inflation rate, would not add to inflation, would not cause additional inflation. It doesn't necessarily mean that if we have a natural unemployment rate, then our inflation must be zero. No, not necessarily. We can have some inflation resulting from other things. The main concept here is if we have natural unemployment rate, then we do not have an inflationary pressure from labor market. So if we have natural rate of unemployment and we do have some inflation, this inflation is not caused by too low unemployment. It is caused by other things. Unemployment does not accelerate inflation rate. It doesn't boost our inflation. That's it. Well, that is all about economic fluctuations. We are going to talk more about business cycles in the next part of this movie. I hope you enjoyed this part of movie. If so, give me a like, please. That would be a very nice way of appreciation. I mean, this is just one click for you, but to me it is a very useful feedback. Some of you may subscribe to my channel because I believe there will be more movies here, so we may stay in touch anyway. Right, thank you guys very much.